Okay, my name is Oscar Macias, and today I'm interviewing Mark Vernon, who lives in Mavinga, Oregon. What was your rank?
I was a quartermaster third class.
Sir.
And I'm going to tell you what the quartermaster is. Quartermaster is actually navigational in the Navy. In the Army, quartermaster deals with like clothes and that kind of, but in the Navy, it's navigation and basically helmsmanship, steering the ships. So. I served predominantly in Vietnam.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
Back during that period of time, my draft number was coming up. I had a brother in the Navy, and I had a brother in the Marine Corps. The brother in the Marine Corps was in Vietnam. The brother in the Navy was on a submarine on the East Coast. And I decided that I didn't want to go to Vietnam, so I joined the Navy versus waiting to get drafted, which I probably would have ended up in Vietnam too.
What were your feelings about being drafted or enlisting?
Like I said, my whole intent was not to go to Vietnam, so that was the focus. So I enlisted knowing that my number was coming up and I was going to get drafted. And emotionally, I suppose, I was kind of gung-ho, so I wasn't against going in the military, but I didn't want to go to Vietnam. But go ahead.
Did you feel like our country needed to go to war?
You know, I think during the time, I think everybody was close enough to the Korean conflict that people still felt like we needed to protect the country, and so, I felt like it was a duty for people to serve. Yeah. Sworn in Portland, Oregon, spent the night at the YMCA, two other guys, Tim Sills and Gary Young, were the two guys I was with, and we shipped out. The next day we flew to San Diego, where I did my boot camp. Anyway, they both were in my unit in Vietnam too, or not in Vietnam, but at the boot camp. It was like going into a whole new world. As soon as you get there, they put you in a line, and every time you go somewhere, you're like in lines everywhere, and so like one of the first things they do is they march you through and put you in a barber chair and shave all your hair off. And that everybody does that. It's a constant thing, and you start out your early days at boot camp or getting kind of oriented to the Navy, and they do all kinds of programs that way, and you get all these shots and stuff. Some real funny things that were funny to me anyway was that when we got shots, they gave it to you in a gun, and it was a multiple shot in one gun, and you go through this line and they'd shoot you in both arms. And they say relax, don't flinch. Well, these guys would flinch, and we're stripped to the waist. These guys would flinch, and then we'd walk outside, and a bunch of them would start passing out because they're flowing blood because they flinched and it cut their arms. And so but that was one of the funny things, I think, for me, was watching guys pass out and getting a shot. And I went, what? And you're going to war? Career Navy man, and he had an apprentice that worked with him, and he was actually a seaman apprentice, so he must have just gone through boot camp, but he was kind of his helper with the unit, I guess called it troop is what we're called. It's our boot camp troop. I actually was in pretty good physical condition at the time, so they appointed me as a petty officer for athletic petty officer. So I basically led all the physical calisthenics. I set up swim teams. We competed in swimming, boxing, so did a bunch of stuff like that. I conformed pretty well to it because it wasn't hard for me, and I knew I could. There were some guys that really had a rough time, but for me, mentally I was okay about it. And I kind of knew what they were trying to do, and so I knew how to play their games. And part of it's just learning to comply and move along with stuff. So, in boot camp, I was the athletic director of boot camp. So my job was basically organizing all the athletics and making sure our guys, getting guys to do certain swimming events in the swimming program. And so it was kind of get everybody oriented that way, getting somebody to box for us and that kind of stuff. One of the things that I thought by going in the Navy, as I said, was I wouldn't go to Vietnam. As it turns out, I had orders to Vietnam right out of boot camp. So I went, well, actually I went to an A school, which was the quartermaster school. And then I went to a harbor training program, which was in Vernon, California. We flew out, the first time I went, we flew out of McCord Air Force Base in Washington. And we flew on a commercial flight. They were flying commercial flights in country then. And going over, we stopped in Hawaii. We had a quick stop in Hawaii to fuel up. We took off again. We flew into Cam Ranh Bay, which is right in about in the middle of South Vietnam. When we flew in, I was in a Boeing 707, and it was all of a sudden the pilot started circling. He was going around and around, and I thought, what is he doing? And he comes on the horn. He says, "Gentlemen, we're being delayed going in. The airport's being rocketed right now, and so I'll get us in there as soon as I can." About 15 minutes later, all of a sudden, and I didn't know you could put these big planes on end, but he literally put it on end like that and went straight down and pulled it out the last second, laid it in there. And I didn't know you could do that with a big plane like that. So I was, and he didn't come on and tell us what he was doing. So I'm thinking, are we going down for the count or what are we doing here? So that was kind of interesting, funny. And then once we got on the ground, we formed up and we had what we called the war wagon, a 50 caliber machine gun, and we all loaded it in to drive up to my unit, which was about 40 miles north of there. When I got to Vietnam, I started, as I said, I was supposed to be doing navigational stuff, but I think the only thing I ever did navigationally was to drive boats when I was in Vietnam. And I did some map overlays one time. And that was the only things I ever did in my MOS. But my first job assignment is I worked in our command center. And I worked there for about 4 months, which basically you're in a tower and you're overlooking the harbor. It's in Nha Trang, Vietnam, by the way, is where we ended up, which is about, well, actually we're out of a village called Cauda, C-A-U-D-A. You can look it up if you want to. And, but it's about 8 miles from Nha Trang. Nha Trang is a very big city in Vietnam, in South Vietnam, and it actually right now is a big tourist city. Anyway, so our job was harbor patrol, and I was in our tower basically doing the operational part of making sure our boats were in the certain sectors they were supposed to be in, communicating with them. If they had problems or needed some input about what to do, we were always communicating with them. An interesting event that occurred to me during that period of time, 4 months, was that I was on duty in the tower, myself, and there was like, I think 2 or 3 of us up there, an officer and a couple of us enlisted guys. And I'm sitting at this desk and the phone rings. And I pick up the phone and the guy on the other end of the line says, "I'd like to speak to Mark Vernon." And I said, "You're speaking to him." He said, "This is your brother, Greg. He was in Vietnam. He was in communications, but where he was able to patch through a call to talk to me." We talked for about 3 minutes, and all of a sudden he says, I can hear in the background, they were getting rocketed. He says, "Rocket's incoming, gotta go. See you later." I was like, okay. So that was kind of a funny event that was kind of weird. There's 125 guys in our unit, so the odds of him actually getting me were probably pretty slim. So for about 4 months I did that. Then I worked on our boats. We had boats that were called LCPLs, Landing Craft Personnel Light, and they're a 36-foot boat with a 771 diesel engine. And we did harbor patrol on those. So we go out and we patrol the harbor. If there's junks, fishing vessels coming through, we stop them and search them, looking for VC, looking for any kind of monies or ammunitions or guns or anything that might be on board. So we have them, we check their IDs, if they didn't have IDs, we arrest them, take them in. And then the other things we did is, when the ships come into the harbor, we board the ships, we tell them about our security levels, what they have to do. If it's condition red, they have to leave the harbor. And kind of explain everything to them, introduce ourselves, tell them what our job is. So then we go around all the time and we drop concussion grenades, which are an explosive grenade, non-fragmental, but if a diver was down there, it would blow his brains out, basically. So the idea was to keep the VC from coming in and putting packs on these vessels and blowing them up. So that was one of our jobs. So I did that. That was the second period that I had. And I did that for about, probably 5 months. And then I was selected to be an advisor to the Vietnamese. So I actually went and I worked on a Vietnamese patrol boat. When I started, I didn't speak any Vietnamese. When I got done, I could do fairly well in speaking Vietnamese. And anyway, so my job was to coordinate the Vietnamese patrols. They had an old French Coast Guard cutter with a 40 caliber turret machine gun on it. And so my job was to coordinate with our units when they were out. And we did the same kind of functions on it. We stopped vessels, searched them. If we had times when we got into firefights with the VC on the shore. But that was kind of all that function with the Vietnamese. So my role was in that job I worked every other night. So I got every other day off. Then I came back to our unit and I worked for the Vietnamese for about not quite a year and a half. Then I came back to our unit and I worked on our Boston whalers, which are speedboats, 18-foot speedboat with a 85 horsepower outboard Johnson motor on, so they're really fast. And, you know, we zip all over the place in them. And the other thing I did, I was kind of I did a little bit of everything, and I went to a recon school, a 5th Special Forces Reconnaissance School. That's the Green Berets Reconnaissance School in country. And for a month, I trained to be on recon. Then I came back to our unit and was on a recon team. So we used to do recons after spooky fires, gunships that shot up areas, or we were going in to look for some VC or some VC movement on islands or stuff. So that's I was on the recon team too.
Did you see any combat?
Yeah, we would periodically get into firefights, but mainly they were on the shore and we were on our boats. So like I can remember a couple of times we picked them out. We had what's called starlight scopes, and you can see at night, and so we could actually see movement on the shore. And so we had an area that it was called the VC area, because they would come in there and go down and fish or wash themselves or something. And so we would periodically see groups of them come in, and we'd just start shooting, and they'd fire back at us. And, yeah.
Were there many casualties in your unit?
No, I was really fortunate that we were far enough away from the firefighting. When we fired, we were, I don't know, a couple hundred yards offshore, so we could shoot a fair distance with our weapons. We had on the front of our boats when I first got there, we had a 50 caliber machine gun on the stern. So on the bow we had a 50 caliber, on the stern we had a 50 caliber. And then about halfway through my tours over there, we switched over and got a 40 millimeter mortar on the stern. So we were firing mortar rounds as well as 50 caliber machine gun fire. Plus we all had M16s. Well, one that I remember was there was a typhoon that came through the area. And originally I wasn't on the crews that went out to run our boats, because we had to keep them away from our pier and out in the water so that they wouldn't get banged up. And originally I wasn't, but I was the next junior guy that had to go out. So one guy got sick, they picked me up, I had to go out with them. And so we were riding 20-foot swells in the harbor. And the next morning, after the typhoon went through and everything, we had a pier that was there that had these concrete slabs that were probably 10 by 20, and they were probably 8 inches thick. And that typhoon was so strong, and the water was so strong coming in, that it picked them up and stacked them up like dominoes. It was totally amazing, just to see. So, you know, I think the camaraderie on our group was really good. That was the nice part. So we had some really close experiences, good friends that I had made from Vietnam.
What was food like?
Food? Um, we actually, Navy generally has a lot of vegetables. We had trouble getting meat at times, but generally our food was pretty good. We ate, like I said, sea rations when we were on patrol. So we had our P-38s, and so you got things like, I'll tell you another funny story. You get things like beanies and weenies and spaghetti and lima beans and ham, and gosh, I remember all of those. So you had these little like boxes of that stuff. And one time we took over the boat from another crew, so they get off, we fuel up, get on, we're heading out, we're out there for a little while, and we had these cushions, and I was on a cushion on the top of the engine cover, and all of a sudden there was this huge loud explosion. And we opened up the engine compartment, and one of the guys on the crew before us had put his beans and weenies on the manifold to heat it up, and forgot they didn't put them there. And it got so hot that the can exploded. And there was beanies and weenies all over the inside of that engine. So that was pretty fun. As other food, you know, there was times when, well, there's another so funny story. The rats over there were really big. And our cook for Thanksgiving one time had commandeered, I don't know where he got it, but he got some actual turkeys. And he put them out to thaw out in the galley. And he went in there, and the rats were eating these huge rats. I mean, they were like dogs size, eating these turkeys. So we ended up having canned turkey for Thanksgiving because of the rats. So that was another time we had T-bone steaks. I don't know, the platters that you serve food on in the military are about like that. And our cook, who was really what they call it commandeering or cumshawing. So it's trading one thing for another. Well, the Army couldn't get vegetables. They had trouble getting vegetables. Well, we had crates and crates of lettuce and stuff, and so we had a couple extra crates of lettuce. So our cook made contact with the cook on the Army base, and they had T-bone steaks. And these T-bone steaks were that big and that thick. And the cook cooked them to order. And so that was a real special meal that we had over there. There was a couple of, there was a Filipino tugboat that we were friends with. And they pulled up to our pier one time, and they cooked us a meal of fried rice and Oriental food. It was really good. So we had special times. But when I was with the Vietnamese Navy, they would cook fish in a bowl with rice, and that's what we'd have to eat. So,
Did you have plenty of supplies?
plenty of supplies. It was really hard to get supplies. I came off a reconnaissance mission one time, and there was a captain that had come on board our unit, and so we're standing. He was inspecting us or greeting us as we came in, and so we lined up, and he was walking down, and he looked at me, and he looked down at my boots, and he said, "Sailor," he says, "you need new boots." I said, "Sir, I've been trying to get boots for 6 months." He said, "You'll have 2 pair tomorrow." So sure enough, the next day I had 2 pair of boots. So just to show you whoever's got the power can make it happen. So, but it was hard getting clothing supplies and stuff like that. Generally, food supplies, we were good. We always had reasonable food supplies and stuff. So.
Did you feel pressure or stress?
Yeah, I think you never quite knew what to expect. You know, we had one guy in our unit had a complete psychological breakdown. He was totally psychotic, just standing around staring. Well, I won't say his name, but he was a really, really nice guy, and I felt really sad, and nobody was doing anything, so I finally insisted one of the officers, you know, take him over to the hospital because he was just catatonic. He was just not there. So he had freaked out. He stressed out. You know, we had, when I first went there, I'll tell you about how the stress was. One of the commanding officer hadn't been seen for a long time. He was in his quarters. He was drunk all the time. And the reason that they gave for his being drunk was Hanoi Hannah. I don't know if you ever heard of her, but it was a radio show that was done by a lady who basically was saying that we would never get the barracks built that the Seabees were building for us, that it would get blown up before that happened. And so our commander had gone basically stressed out and started drinking. And so, yeah, I think guys did crazy things. You never quite knew what was going to happen, whether you're going to get fired on a given outing or, what kind of problems you might have. So it was stressful, man.
Was there something special you did for good luck?
No, I don't think so. I'm always pretty upbeat, so I don't feel like I need any good luck charms or anything.
How did people entertain themselves?
How did they entertain themselves?
Yeah.
We had a club. I was an assistant manager of the club for a while. Some guys drank too much. Like I was telling you earlier, we had some of the local Vietnamese bands. We could bring them on our unit to play music. We had films that were brought in and we showed at our parking lot on a big screen that was there. We actually, when conditions were okay, we would go. There was about 4 or 5 of us, 6 of us that went to the Air Force Base where they did a Taekwondo karate class. The Koreans put it on, so a couple of us were doing that. We had in Nha Trang, they had a softball league, so we had a softball team off our unit. We had a football league, had a football team off our unit. So we did all those things, as much as we could, when the conditions were right, and you could do that. So yeah.
What did you do on leave?
On leave. Well, my first return trip, I just came back to McMinnville to see my parents, and that was after a year. So I was in Vietnam for 2 years and 5 months. So the first time I came back, I just came back, it was McMinnville. And then I did an R&R in Taiwan. What was it, 2 weeks? No, 1 week R&R in Taiwan, and then I went back to Taiwan for a week. I'm trying to think, you're talking about leaves. And then I came back home once. The last leave that I was down on a 4-year enlistment, and the last leave was just getting ready. I was just getting ready to go on leave, and I put a request in because they had this what they call a year early out from Vietnam for critical rate, and my rate was considered critical rate. So I put a request in to extend my time in Vietnam 3 more months so that I could get out of the Navy a year early. And the executive officer turned me down. So I went and talked to him, and he was saying I hadn't seen enough of the Navy, and I told him, no, I'd seen more than enough. And I just wanted to get out and go to school and get on with my life. And he still was saying, oh, you haven't seen enough. And so I basically left there frustrated. And he was willing to talk with me about it, but he wasn't going to change his mind. Yeah. So I walked down to the parking lot, and this other officer's name was Long, approached me, and he said, Mark, he said, I understand you put a request in to extend for 3 months with a year early out. And I said, yeah, and I really, really want it. He said, well, he says, you're going on leave, right? I said, yep. He said, well, when you come back, he says, I will be the executive officer, and I will approve it. So when I came back, I put it in again, so I got a year early out, coming out of Vietnam, so.
Where did you travel on while you were in service?
Where did I travel? Well, I told you about okay. Probably the first actual trip we took was to what was called the Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. Yeah, SEER School up at Whidbey Island, Washington. So we flew from Coronado Island, which is just out of San Diego, up to Whidbey Island, Washington for the school. And it was a couple-week school. And then I guess the next thing would be I actually went to Vietnam. So I didn't, like a lot of sailors see the world, I didn't really see the world, I saw a lot of Vietnam. I flew through Japan a couple of times, Yokota. Yeah, I think Yokota, Japan, so once in Anchorage, Alaska. That was about it. I didn't travel
Do you recall any humorous or unusual events?
Well, I told you about the phone call with my brother. I'll tell you, this is kind of there was a number of guys that were killed in Vietnam by friendly fire and by friendly actions. And one night I went down to go on patrol, and we have a pier watch, a guy who's on the pier all night long, drops grenades off the side all night to keep the VC from blowing up our pier. So I go down there, and I can't even remember who this guy was, but I remember what he did. At the time, we'd run out of concussion grenades. So we were using frag grenades and dropping them on the side. So he comes up, pulls the pin on a frag grenade, and drops it right in front of me. So I'm thinking I'm dead meat, and turned to go, and it didn't go off. And I think it was probably the good Lord stepping in to save me, because it was a scary event, and we ended up getting a broom and pushing it into the water. But there's no reason that grenade shouldn't have gone off. So that was kind of a crazy event.
Yeah.
So,
What were some pranks that you pulled or others pulled?
you always do things to lighten the mood. In boot camp, towards the end, a couple guys were sleeping behind the racks of clothes where they weren't supposed to be, and we'd lather up their hands with shaving cream and tickle them. They hit themselves. So that was one of the things we do. But you know, in Vietnam, there wasn't a whole lot of pranks going on, I don't think. You know, part of the reason why I got out of the military is because of the Peter Principle. Are you familiar with the Peter Principle? People rise to their highest level of inadequacy. So a lot of people in the service are at a rank where I couldn't develop much respect for their skill level or what they did. There were some of the officers that I met. The second commanding officer we had was probably one of the nicest guys I ever met. He and I had a lot of personal conversation. There was a group of officers that we called 90-day wonders because they were pretty bright at everything. Came right out of college, went to officer candidate school, came right straight over to Vietnam. But some of them did not have very good common sense. And you can be as bright as the brightest guy in the world, but if you have no common sense, you get people in trouble.
Yeah.
I almost got in trouble with this one officer one time. He almost got me killed. So I didn't appreciate that too much. But other than that, there was a lot of good people, and then there was people who were just problem people. You know, and you find it everywhere in life. You know, people who do stupid things or want to do stupid things. And, yeah. The day what?
Do you recall the day your service ended?
Yeah, very clearly. May the 17th, 1970. Excuse me. As I said, I got a year early out. So they sent me to Pier 91 in Seattle, Washington, about 2 weeks before my out date. I got in line to process out on a Friday and was in the line processing, and they said, "Mark Vernon?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Well," they said, "you can't process out today. You're not within the 1 year out until next Monday." So I had to wait until Monday. Mind you, this is how the military works. I'm doing nothing. They're paying me. I'm sitting around. I don't have any job or anything, though they had originally assigned me a job. Nobody ever said, "Hey, come and do this." So basically I'm sitting around, so they pull me out, so I have to wait 2 more days before I can process out. Anyway, that was yeah, so I remember real clearly, and I remember how great it felt walking off that base and saying, "I'm done with this." I was supposed to do reserve duty, but they had a thing where if it was inconvenient, I went one time to a reserve meeting and never went back, and they didn't ever come after me, so.
What did you do in the days and week after?
When I came back, I kind of was decompressing. I just felt like I didn't want to do a whole lot. So I spent about, well, a couple weeks not doing anything. And then I filed for unemployment, and I drew that for about 2 weeks. And then I was getting bored. So I went out to a trailer factory in McMinnville and walked in and told them I was the best worker they'd ever get. You need to hire me, and they did. And so I worked there for a year and a half. Then I went to college after that.
Was there conflict returning after your service ended, or was it just hard to adjust?
You know, I think a lot of it was in the media with the rallies against Vietnam, and it felt like it was against the Vietnam vets for me. And so the conflict really was about how people viewed me and viewed us. And so I didn't, probably until about 15 or 20 years ago, I didn't ever tell anybody I was in Vietnam. So, I mean, if they asked, I wouldn't lie to them, but I never ever offered that.
Did you work or go back to school?
I worked for a year and a half, like I said. And that was because I was still trying to get oriented to getting into school, so I had to apply and all that stuff. And the timing wasn't right back in May, so I had to wait until, and then the next year didn't land out well for me, so I waited until 71 to start college.
Was your education supported by the GI
Bill? Yeah. The GI Bill actually was very, very helpful. My wife worked, I married just before I went to college. My wife worked, so we had the GI Bill, and then I learned about what's called LEAP funds, law enforcement. Anyway, it was a fund that was set up to basically give you money to go to college if you were in a correction or law enforcement field. And then if you worked in that field after you got out, every so many days or weeks or whatever, they would reduce your amount owed. So eventually mine just went away. So I got money from that. But that was only for the last year I was in college, because I didn't know about it until then. So.
Did you make any close friends while in service?
Very close friends. When I first came back, let me go back. When I was in Vietnam, one of my best friends who played on the football team, was a quarterback on our football team over there. His name was Don Mickey. He asked me to be the godfather of his son. So I was the godfather of his son. And then there was 3 other guys that I hung out with quite a bit, and they all got an apartment or a house that they were living in Salt Lake City. And I went down there and visited all of them in 1971. I went down there to see them. And one of them I still have emails with periodically. The guy that came on to do the other night that I didn't work for the Vietnamese, the other Vietnamese advisor, his name's Pat Burke, and I have contact with him. And anyway, yeah, in fact, just the other day he and I emailed each other. And let's see, last year, I've been looking for this one guy for 15 years. I thought he lived in St. Louis, Missouri, so I thought most people get on social media, so I thought, oh, he'll be on social media, and I'll look him up and stuff. And I kept looking for him, couldn't find him. Finally, last year, about probably early summer, I get this message from his son, and he says, call my dad. If you're this Mark Vernon, call my dad at this number. So I called him, and he and his wife came out in October, and we hadn't seen each other for 49 years. And first thing, he saw me, and he looked at me and he says, you haven't changed a bit. And I looked at him and I said, you haven't changed a bit either. So we actually took him to go to Mexico in October. His wife does not like to travel out of the country, so she didn't go, but yeah, I'm in contact with this guy, and I'll get together. He likes to golf. We'll golf together probably this summer down in Des Moines. He lives in Des Moines, Iowa. He doesn't live in St. Louis. So anyway, yeah. So I was really excited about that.
Did you continue any of those relationships?
Well, I just made that with Don Mackey, the guy I told you about. I've seen him a couple of times. He lives in Bakersfield, California now. But there's nobody real local around here. A couple of well, they weren't in my unit, but the two guys I told you about who I went to service with, I've tried to locate the one guy, Tim Sills, but I have not been able to find him anywhere on social media or anything. The other guy, Gary Young, he became a corpsman and he died in Vietnam. So, yeah.
Did you join a veterans organization?
I belong to the American Legion, and I go there for meals predominantly and to hang out with vets, guys that have been there, you know. And it's actually been a healing process for me because they've had similar experiences and you feel real comfortable around them. So, yeah.
What did you go on to do as a career after the war?
As a career after Vietnam, I went to college. Originally, I wanted to work with youth. And so for 2.5 years, I worked at a youth care center called Rainbow Lodge, which was out of McMinnville, about 9.5 miles up in the hills. So I was one of two lead counselors, and I worked there for, like I say, 2.5 years, and then basically did groups and worked with delinquent youth for that time. And then I hired in Washington County, in Hillsborough, I hired on as a jail counselor, so I set up a whole jail program for drug intervention and drug treatment, release planning. So I was the first Washington County jail counselor, but I was also, technically I was a probation officer because that was the classification I was hired into by the community corrections program, which was separate from the jail or the sheriff's office. And so I did that for 8 months, and then I did a caseload, and then after I'd been with the county for about 5 years, I was hired on as a supervisor, so I carried a small caseload of work with people too, and with staff.
Did your military experience influence you thinking about the war or about military in general?
Did it influence me in thinking about the war or?
About war.
Did. I didn't want my kids to ever have to go do that. So I guess from that perspective, yeah. I'm not opposed to war if it makes sense. I think we've been in a lot of senseless wars. And I think history always bears out which one were and which ones weren't. So, yeah, I think it probably had an influence on me.
If in a veterans organization, what kinds of activities does your post or locations have?
Oh, the American Legion, they do all kinds of charitable stuff for veterans. They have all kinds of gatherings for people. You know, they have potlucks. Like I say, they have food, so you can go there and eat. Best prime rib you'll ever eat down there, I guarantee you. Huge prime rib steaks. And they just do a lot of charitable things. They have a motorcycle group that does funerals and stuff like that for vets. So it's just be offering support and care for the vets and stuff here.
Did you attend any reunions?
That's interesting. I didn't know of one. There was one here in the state of Oregon for my group, by the way, was called Inshore Undersea Warfare Group 1, IUWG1. And they had a reunion 4 years ago, I think, down in Ashland. And I just learned about it. They have a website. And so I went on the website and learned about the reunion. I actually saw photos of some of the guys that I served with and stuff, but I didn't know about it before it happened, so I didn't go to it. I might look one up and try to go. I don't know. We'll see.
How did your family feel about the war?
I think my parents were very proud because my brother and I both served, and my folks were very patriotic. I think during that time, most people were confused about their feelings towards it, but I think because we were involved in it, my folks were very proud that we were there, and they were okay.
Tell me about any conflicts you felt while serving in the war.
You know, I think if you don't know a culture, people tend to go through a cycle of racism. And I said, I went through that too. And so I really initially had started off with pretty hostile feelings towards the Vietnamese in general. And by the end of my experience, I really loved the people and I loved the culture. And so it really was a lesson for me in racism. It was, that was one of the neatest experiences, but it was a conflict that I went through as I was there as well. You get a Vietnam medal, campaign medal, and I had 3 tour buttons on mine, as I recall. Good conduct, ribbon, medal, but just your standard ones. Nothing, a Vietnamese, or the Vietnamese, what's it called? Vietnam service ribbon or something like that. I did get 2 commendations while I was there. They had me listed as a career petty officer, so they think I was going to be a career guy. So they recognized me for my work with the Vietnamese, and also for my work on the different boats that I drove and was actively involved with. So,
how did the war mentally affect you?
You know, initially, I think I was bitter, largely because of the reactions of people stateside. I felt like less than a person. I felt like, everybody's talking down to the Vietnam vets. And I didn't realize until probably 10 or 15 years ago, I think I finally realized that I was really angry about it. And then I started talking to people, and I've actually embraced the experience more, which has helped me decrease my anger about that experience.
How did your service and experiences affect your life?
Well, I think I became more compulsive, obsessive compulsive. By that I mean everything is very regimented in the military. I still fold all of the bathroom towels the way I folded them when I was in the service. I fold my underpants the same way. Everything is done because whoever thought out how to do things in the military, they actually make sense. And so, so in that way, it's affected my life. And I'd like to think of it as a positive. I think I've had to deal with some, process through some emotional issues related to it, not to the extreme that some people have. I tend to deal with conflict or with pain different than most. I process and do a lot of cognitive processing to analyze, look at it, and let go. Yeah.
Is there anything you would like to add that we did not cover in this interview?
I just hope, I see our society softening and being more supportive of our vets. And I think hopefully we can all remember that, what those people are doing for us in our lives. And so my only comments are is that as people listen to this, that they understand the importance of being kind and caring to somebody who's been through a war experience.
Thank you, Mark, for sharing your recollections today.
Thank you, Missy. Camera lady.
Oh, sorry.
Well, we're done, I guess.
Yeah.